There are three parts to it. There are three texts that students have to read. Each text could be around sort of 800, 900 words long, so three of those, they've got quite a lot of material that they need to get through. The essential difference between the Ielts academic and the general training papers is essentially the fact that the academic test is more suitable for people who want to enter university programme of study. They could come from journals or newspapers. The general training texts are taken from the sort of texts that you're more likely to encounter in everyday life, so from magazines and newspapers. It's less of an academic feel to it. There's different sub-skills, different types of reading skills that the candidates need to be engaging when they're doing the test. A candidate could be trying to get an overview of the main idea of an entire text and deciding what the best heading for the entire text is. They could also be deciding on what the correct heading is for each paragraph. So this is very much about understanding the main idea of a paragraph or a text. But they could be reading for detail. They could be reading to extract specific bits of information that they then transfer into a summary, for example. To be really successful at reading in the Ielts test, you need to be able to read quickly and extract meaning quickly. And this is important for teachers to do. Their students need to be able to read something without reading every single word and trying to understand every single word. A lot of it is about what is the main idea. There is a big idea of if you develop your skimming and scanning skills in Ielts, and skimming obviously is the sort of gist reading for main ideas, and scanning is finding specific information. There is this myth that if you develop those, then you're going to be fine and you're going to be able to get a really high score at reading. But it's not necessarily about just skimming a text and scanning a text. It's understanding what you're skimming and scanning. I always try and get my students to be able to read at a speed that is comfortable for them, to go through it quickly, but not too fast that they are not getting any of the meaning. Here it's also useful to develop memory strategies. So, for example, get your students to read a paragraph, and before they move on to the next paragraph, just stop and in their head or on a piece of paper just summarise the main ideas and any details that they can remember. And if you think of the fact that they have got a huge number of words to get through over the course of that hour, they're not going to remember everything. So the more you can help them to break down their reading into bite-sized chunks, get to the end of the paragraph, okay, think, what was the main idea there, what was this and that, right, and then move on. Because there's only so much you can retain in your working memory, in your short-term memory, and you need to be able to read quickly, yes, but also remember information. It is such an important thing to go through the papers and then leave yourself some time to go back and check your answers. And students know they need to do it, but they think, well, I'm never going to get time to be able to do it. But there's one way that I think you can help them, and that is just to show them, for example, okay, if you do a reading text and you're there and you're underlining the correct answers or what you think the correct answers are and this important bit of information, what you end up with is a reading passage that is covered in all these underlines and lines here, lines there, and it just becomes a bit of a mess. The issue is that when they go back, if they've got time to check their answers, they don't necessarily know where the answers are because all they can see is this sea of lines and underlining. Now, I always try and get my students to, when they think they've got an answer, next to it, on the page, on the question page, write the number of the question. It just seems something very, very simple, but it's something that very few students actually do. And what it means is that they've got 3 long passages that they need to read and go through and get the correct answers. They've got no hope of checking their answers unless they know where to find the original answer that they thought was correct. So if you try and train them to annotate all the way, every single question, put the question by the side, exactly where you think it is in the text, put a little circle around it, then when it comes to them going through at the end, they can quickly find where they thought the answer was and then they can check it. And it really, really helps because that going back to something with fresh eyes after you've gone through a lot of reading, that sometimes they can pick up on the fact, no, that's not right. but they'll also go back to it and think, yeah, I was absolutely right the first time. So it's a time-saving device, but it just helps as well in that really important bit at the end. What you can find with the Mindset series is that at the lower level, it provides students with texts of a length and a complexity that is tailored towards them at the lower level. Shorter length texts, not quite as difficult in terms of the complexity of language, and in each level, that builds up. So if you start at one particular level and you go up to level 3, by the time you get to level 3, you'll find that the length of the text and the complexity, there's more of a similarity to what you will find in the Ielts test itself. And each part of the unit focuses on a different question type. So with this one, it might be matching headings and true, false, not given. You can then double up with the online practice on that, which focuses on the skills that you need for each one. Because not every student is going to be able to do this type of question and that type, and all the types of questions. People have different strengths and weaknesses. And that's kind of important for a teacher to know who in their class has trouble with a particular question type, and they can then suggest, well, you've got a bit more online practice in that question type, so go away and do it and see how you get on. So it can be, then we're in this wonderful area of ping, learner autonomy. Wonderful, off you go yourself. The one thing that teachers need to try and get across to students at a lower level is, not in a negative way, but the fact is you are not going to get every question right. But that said, not every question in any Ielts test is going to be as equally as difficult as the previous or the following one. Some questions are more difficult than others. And in a way, it's basic exam technique that if every question is worth the same number of points, you get the same credit for each question, do the ones you can do. Get those scores on the board, get those in the bag before you go back to the ones that you're having more trouble with. And I find, as a general rule of thumb, if a student is spending longer than 2 minutes on one particular question, that is far too long. They need to be trained to get to a stage of, right, I still can't find the answer, and then move along. You just have to, in a way, cut your losses and say, I'm not going to get that question. I might be able to if I come back to it. Again, it's exam technique that is transferable to other exams in other contexts, but it is an important thing. Get what you know before you go back to the ones that are more difficult. So don't struggle your way through every single one. From my own experience, I have found that if you're in a general English class, you can go in with a reading text, and the students might be very interested in sort of exploring the language that's used within that text and moving on from there, and why the writer's chosen a particular grammatical structure in this position. Now, in an Ielts class, the students are far less interested in that exploration of language. What they want to know is, what's the right answer, what's the wrong answer, and why? That's it at the end of the day, because that's what they've come for. How do I get the right answer in the Ielts test? So for any teacher new to Ielts, if you've got a reading text that has yes, no, or not given questions, make sure that you know before you go into that classroom why the answer is yes and not no and not given. Why the answer might be no and it isn't yes and it isn't not given. Because you need to be able to explain that to students, and certainly with yes, no, not given, and true, false, not given, they're often puzzling for students, so you need to be able to understand it. And if you go away before any class, know that text pretty much inside out, know the questions inside out, the whys and why nots, because it will help you to deal with those questions that you might be a bit nervous about when a student asks you, well, why is that the answer? You can't improvise in Ielts, you can't have a quick look, because then you've lost the class. They need to have trust in you, that you know the test, you know the material you're giving them, and you know the skills that you're trying to get them to develop. So know the text before you go into class. This is how the teacher's book will help, because it gives you that support before you even set foot into the classroom.